Ankelium Down, written by Nik Hein, narrated with the help of the AI.
Chapter 6. Turned out Niels wasn't as clueless about the galley's inner workings, or its comm systems, as he'd let on. At the very least, he knew more than Dams. Sure, like any special ops officer, Dams had his share of technical know-how, but it was the specialized kind, related either to the weapons and gear used by special forces, or to whatever schematics and specs his team had crammed before a mission. Cargo ships, and especially prison galleys, weren't exactly his area of expertise. His only experience with ships like this had been as a passenger, or cargo, memory helpfully reminded him, a bitter echo of how casually the Imperial curator had tagged him. "You got a comm unit or something? Anything?" Dams asked, prying at another floor seal with the belt buckle Niels had given him. "I don't buy that you guys moved around the ship without any comms at all." Niels was working a different hatch with a small multi-tool. When Dams shot him a look, as he knew damn well guards weren't supposed to carry gear like that around the prison, Niels just shrugged and muttered, "I was off duty." In any case, it was a blessing they had something. Without tools, even something as basic as a belt buckle or a toy-sized gadget, they wouldn't have cracked open a single panel. The covers had been sealed a long time ago, and the bolts holding them in were sitting very tight. "I've got comm, of course," Niels said, still focused on the panel in front of him. They'd opened 5 sockets already, all of them of no use. "But it won't do us much good. I bet the aliens scanning everything. The second we go live, they'll have a fix on us. If we will keep hiding here like a couple of rats, they'll find us anyway," Dams muttered. "The galley is one big ugly piece of the ship, but not that big. Sooner or later, they'll map it out." He finally popped the next seal. "Damn it, this one's empty too." Niels wedged the flat tip of a tiny screwdriver under the edge of the wall panel and slowly pried the hard plastic cap loose, working it out like a lever. Getting down on all fours, he peered into the hole, then shoved his arm in, almost to the shoulder, and pulled out a neatly zip-tied bundle of thin wires and light guides, coiled into a compact, tidy loop. Well, chalk one up for Imperial tidiness over classic technician laziness, Niels muttered, fishing a communicator from his pocket. Dams took one look at the comm and could tell it was old. Both the model and the manufacturing date were relics. Honestly, that might have been a good thing. Odds were, a newer unit wouldn't even have the right ports to match cables older than it was. "You sure these backup comm lines can even be reactivated?" Dams asked. "I mean, for all we know, they might all end in sealed-off caps like this one." "They might," Niels admitted, plugging the first cable into the scratched-up port after double-checking that the communicator's wireless functions were disabled. "But my money's still on lazy maintenance crews." 15 minutes later, his confidence had taken a serious hit. Not a single cable from the first bundle worked. They pried open more wall panels, found another set, and the first 5 wires in that one were also dead, disconnected, unpowered, or just plain useless for who knows what reasons. "Looks like that didn't work," Dams said, watching as a grim-faced Niels plugged in last wire with cracked insulation. "Time to start thinking about Plan B. Any ideas?" Niels nodded, still poking at the communicator's screen. "I've got a few, but you're not gonna like them. Plenty of options, but they all kind of circle back to the same likely outcome. 2 corpses with holes in their heads. Damn it. I was really hoping something still worked." He grabbed the last connector. "You believe in luck? Or omens?" he asked suddenly. It was such a stupid question it caught Dams off guard, but he didn't smile. "No. Figures. Bad luck even there," Niels muttered. "Back in my day, most soldiers were superstitious as hell. Guess asking you to spit over your shoulder would be pointless. Back in his day, Dams thought, watching Niels wrestle with the uncooperative cable. What exactly does he mean by his day? The guy clearly had a more colorful past than he let on. The way he was handling the tools, the way he moved, even that limp. A military background would explain a lot. Dams had never seriously considered what he'd do if he got taken out of action, if he got wounded so bad that it had ended his career. Maybe he should have. But before the arrest, there'd never been time to dig that question out of the dark, dusty corner of his mind where he'd buried it. And after the arrest, well, nothing from his past life had seemed to matter anymore. At least, not until the day the door to his cell had unexpectedly slid open. "There!" Niels suddenly shouted, voice hoarse with excitement. "Son of a bitch! We've got it!" Dams leaned in so fast they almost cracked heads. On the communicator's small LCD screen, a web of angular blue lines bloomed into view. Dams instantly recognized the general layout of the galley. A few minutes later, it became clear that their success wasn't quite what they'd hoped for. The old redundant comm system, what was left of it, was mostly dead. Most of it had been disconnected years ago, and whatever still remained had long since deteriorated and malfunctioned. "At least it's showing something. That means it's still linked into the main network," Niels said. "Sure, it's probably third-tier fallback, maybe even fourth. Not exactly top priority. But we still have to assume the aliens might pick up our presence. Depends on how deep they've chewed into our system codes." "Doesn't matter much anyway," Dams replied. "No cameras, no motion sensors, no life scanners, no real intel. What is this thing even?" "Don't be so quick to dismiss it," Niels said. "Far as I can tell, it's a backup alert tracking loop, the one tied into the automated defense protocols." That got Dams's attention. He gave Niels a sharper look. "Now that's more interesting," he said, narrowing his eyes. "If we can get access to that, what have you got here? Combat drones? Auto turrets?" "This is a prison galley, not a goddamn boarding longship," Niels replied dryly. "Just a few odds and ends, minor stuff. But it doesn't matter anyway. The system we've tapped into is passive, no direct control access. But," he added quickly, seeing the disappointment on Dams's face, "we can still pull something useful out of it. Right now, we're only seeing a small section of the ship. But if I adjust the scale..." He tapped a few keys. "Look." The image suddenly zoomed out, pulling back until the whole galley came into view. A ghostly wireframe of glowing blue and red lines. Niels pressed a few more buttons, lowering the detail level. The ship's massive angular hull now looked like a toy model made from two sets of plastic building blocks, red and blue. There was a lot more red. Dams understood immediately. "Those red areas, that's where the aliens have control?" he asked. Niels shook his head. "Not exactly. Red just marks areas where the sensors are offline. But I doubt the crew shut them down, if any of them are even still alive. Means the aliens haven't hacked into the central core yet. They're disabling sections manually, one by one." He zoomed in again. "See us?" Dam squinted at the three-dimensional mesh of red and blue, and finally managed to make out the elongated rectangular structure of the drive deck, glowing in red. Not far from it, tucked closer to the starboard side, he spotted a much smaller blue cube buried in the maze of corridors and chambers. "That's it," Niels said as Dams pointed at it. "And we need to move. I just watched several compartments between us and the drive deck go red. They're coming." Dams glanced back at the sealed door behind them, a reflex he couldn't quite suppress. Damn. A few months in the prison camps had clearly dulled his edge more than he'd thought. "Where to?" Niels tapped a few more keys, zooming in on the section of the galley they were in. "Here," he said, dragging a finger through the maze of lines to a spot roughly the same distance from their current position as the engine deck, but in the opposite direction. "What's there?" Niels stood and turned toward the door in the far bulkhead, directly across from the sealed hatch they'd come through. "A room full of presents," he said. "Or so I hope." "Presents?" Dams was starting to get irritated by the overseer's habit of speaking in cryptic half-jokes, but there was no point arguing about it now. "What kind of presents?" Niels looked back and winked. "The kind you're really gonna like," he said, "and the kind our uninvited guests really won't." The long dormant instincts of orientation and spatial awareness, once finely honed, were finally starting to wake from the coma they'd been forced into by months of prison routine and solitary confinement aboard the galley. Dams hadn't memorized, or honestly, even fully registered, the route Niels had traced on the communicator screen. But he'd caught the general direction. Now, as they moved from one compartment to the next, crawling through tight maintenance walkways and narrow ladders, he was already beginning to build a rough mental map, logging junctions, corners, and passageways. Niels still hadn't bothered to explain what exactly was so special about their destination. But Dams didn't press him. Whatever it was, they'd know soon enough. And if Niels was leading him into a trap, well, so be it. The thought came on suddenly, like a static charge. How much did he actually know about Niels's resistance to mental influence? Only what the overseer had claimed. What if he was under the alien's control? What if this whole thing was all theater designed to deliver Dams exactly where they wanted him? There were gaps in that theory, sure. Why go through the trouble with the dead cables? But who knew what those things were really capable of? Rumor had it the Emperor and his closest kin could plant thoughts, rewrite memories, influence minds on levels even advanced scanners couldn't detect. Maybe these creatures could do the same, or worse. Paranoid? Maybe. But Dams knew, even the most unlikely scenarios were worth keeping on the board. He had learned that the hard way. "Some maze," Dams muttered to Niels's back. "Used to military ships, huh? Everything neat, labeled, laid out with a ruler." Niels replied without stopping, just turned his head slightly. "Like I said, this galley is way bigger than it needs to be for hauling cargo. That's why they use it for other stuff sometimes, and they rebuild it however the hell they want. These people, their budget's bottomless." Dams thought about that a bit. What people? And what kind of stuff needs to be handled in secret on a repurposed prison ship? What people, you ask? Niels gave a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Guys like our dear curator, for starters. As for the stuff, he paused. Let's just say, the less you know, the better you sleep, kid. I believe under different circumstances, you might have been put to more effective use. Dams recalled the curator's strange words. He looked at Niels's back again. Maybe this is what he meant. Would Dams have become an overseer? Voluntarily, never. But if it meant survival, he didn't have an answer and didn't want one, didn't dare to want. Or maybe the stuff was something else entirely. He'd always thought of the curator as just another faceless imperial functionary, one of the many middle-tier bloodlines in the Emperor's vast genetic pool. But Niels clearly implied it wasn't that simple. So, what was it then? Dams didn't get a chance to finish the thought. Niels suddenly stopped and said, We're here. Let's hope something's still left. He turned the locking lever and, with effort, pulled open the heavy hatch, in the side bulkhead of the long corridor. It was Dams's reflexes that saved them, instincts too deeply etched into muscle and nerve to be erased by prison time, even in the Venusian mines. He didn't even have time to register what was happening. His body moved before his brain caught up. His arms shoved Niels sideways on sheer autopilot, and he dropped low just as the muzzle of a fléchette rifle swung toward him. The burst ripped through the air above his head with a sharp hiss, slicing through the space he'd just vacated. As always in moments like this, Dams's mind shut out everything that didn't directly pertain to survival. In a kill zone, you don't care about the color of the attacker's eyes or who's the author of the ugly painting on the wall. His analysis ran like this, not in words, but in a flash of hardwired perception, compressed into the span of a heartbeat. Rectangular room, cabinets built into the walls around the perimeter, no cover, shooter in the far left corner, fléchette rifle, distance, roughly 5 meters. That snapshot locked into his brain in less than a second. The next second, he was already moving, ducking low and sprinting toward the gunman. If the shooter had been a real professional, even a rusty one like Dams, the odds would have been slim to none. Classic scenario, 2 targets, 1 rifle. Pick who to shoot first. But this guy wasn't trained for that kind of judgment call. He reacted decently, better than most civilians would have, but not fast enough. That single instant of hesitation, that moment of doubt about which threat to prioritize. It was all Dams needed. 2 more bursts hissed over his head, and Dams, in the midst of his charge, had just enough time to think. If Niels was smart enough to hit the floor, he should be fine. The shots were aimed way too high. Then he slammed into the shooter, driving him down hard. They hit the deck in a tangle of limbs and gear, the rifle clattering off to the side. The fact that the guy had been using a rifle actually played to Dams's advantage. A fléchette rifle packed way more punch than a sidearm, no question, but in close quarters grappling, especially once it hit the ground game, it was nearly impossible to keep control of it, let alone fire it effectively. By the time Niels rushed over, the fight was already done. All that was left for the overseer was to retrieve the weapon, which had skidded a meter or 2 away. "Dead?" Niels asked, still aiming at the man sprawled on the floor. "Nope. Why would I?" Dams replied, rising to his feet. "We need intel. Any tiny bits of it. Other than your red zones, we know nothing about what's going on aboard this ship." He glanced down at the unconscious figure. "So, got anything to tie him up with?" Instead of answering, Niels crouched and unfastened something from the downed man's belt. "I've got something better," he said, handing Dams a strip of gray material, shot through with faint silver threads, along with a small remote, like a key fob for an e-car or a skimmer. "I'm guessing you know how to handle this?" Dams knew. He'd been introduced to smart restraints plenty of times, both as a prisoner and, before that, as a special forces officer. He quickly wrapped the band around the wrists of the unconscious man, making sure not to cinch it too tight, then pressed the button on the remote. A pulse of sparks ran through the silvery threads, and the ends of the band fused instantly with the strip at the center, bonding solid. Now, unless someone hit the release again and powered down the nano batteries, the restraints weren't coming off. You couldn't cut them, stretch them, or slip out. And if the restrained person started thrashing or put too much tension on the band, the soft fabric would harden into rigid cuffs. When Dams rolled the man onto his back, Niels muttered something under his breath, low, guttural, and definitely not polite. "You know him?" Dams asked. Niels let out a sigh. "Of course. Our team on Finval is undermanned. There were only around 30 people working cargo detail." Dams didn't catch the name at first, but when he did, He couldn't help the brief, involuntary smirk. Finval? Really? Oh, come on. You must be kidding me. Who would call a prison galley that? Niels shrugged. Leftover from when the ship was still an ark. Some migration bureau official with too much imagination and not enough oversight. When they repurposed it, they didn't bother changing the name. You know how fleet people are. Superstition and tradition, wrapped in steel plating. Dams just shook his head. So who is he? He looks like he could be your... He didn't finish the sentence. My son? Niels said quietly. Yeah, if I'd had one. He'd be older than Eric. Are you too? No. Niels shook his head. Not a friend, just someone I knew. But I liked the kid. Look, this isn't the mines, sure, but you still know what kind of people end up working on prison galleys. Eric hadn't turned into one of them yet. Not like the old-timers around here. Dams had a question on the tip of his tongue. And you? Did you turn into one of them? But he kept it to himself. Now wasn't the time. The kid looked barely older than 20. Standard-issue guard uniform, no decorations. Just another rank-and-file enforcer. His facial features hinted at European refugee ancestry, like Niels, but his skin tone and dark hair suggested some Indian lineage as well. Probably born in one of the second belt orbital cities, Dams guessed. A nasty scrape on the kid's right cheekbone was turning purple, likely from the collision with Dams, but Dams also noticed more bruises, and a couple of cuts scattered across his face. Niels spotted them too. You hit him hard. I barely blinked. That wasn't me, Dams said, pointing to a deep scratch across Eric's forehead. See? He wiped the blood off at first, smeared it, then it dried like that. Our friend here got into a fight with someone before I showed up. Aliens? Niels asked, unconsciously raising the rifle again as he spoke. Nope, I don't think so, Dams replied. We've both seen what they're capable of and how they operate. You think they'd bother with a fist fight? Then how'd he get here? And who worked him over? Dams waved the question away. Doesn't matter right now. He's neutralized. We'll sort it out later. First things first. What is this place? You said something about presents? Niels took a few steps toward the wall lined with standard locker doors. He opened one, peeked inside, then another, and another. With each door, his expression grew darker. Dams followed suit, checking the nearest cabinet. One look was enough. It explained Niels's hope and the disappointment that followed. He'd seen plenty of these lockers before, in various configurations, each tailored to a different payload. This was your armory? Dams asked. Sort of, Niels said, still moving methodically down the row. One of the small reserve stockpiles, meant for unexpected situations. Dams nodded slowly. You mean riots? Yeah. Niels slammed the last cabinet shut, frustration clear in the sound. We have to check them one by one, he muttered. Take the ones on the far wall, will you? Dams stepped over the unconscious body and opened the first locker in the back row. A rifle rack, empty slots for 4 weapons, a few shelves coated in dust. Nothing else. Wait, there were actually riots on galleys? Dams asked. Is that even possible? If there were, I never heard of them, Niels replied. But regs are regs. Someone, somewhere, figured it could happen. Or maybe the idea dates back to the migration days. There are a few of these stockpiles scattered across the galley, but this is the only one outside the aliens' control. And naturally, this one's empty as a cadet's brain after finals, Dams muttered, shutting the last locker in his row. Unlucky coincidence, if it is a coincidence. Niels swore under his breath again, low and bitter. The reserve stockpiles were managed by the senior security quartermaster, Aside from him and maybe 2 aides, no one else ever came in here. No idea what— "Chief mate," a voice croaked from the floor. They moved the stockpiles to the main ship's armory on the first officer's orders. I overheard him and the quartermaster screaming at each other 2 days ago. Eric groaned and shifted uncomfortably, still on the floor. "Niels, can I sit up? And who's the guy with you?" Dam spun around. Eric had regained consciousness and was struggling to find a position that didn't make his bound arms scream. Judging by his grimace, the restraints had begun to harden in response to the strain. They were calibrated not to maim the cargo, but mercy had never been the Empire's strong suit. "Why did you shoot at us?" Dam snapped, cutting in before Niels could say a word. Eric looked at Niels. "Is this a mutiny?" he asked. "Did someone release the cargo and—" He stopped, his eyes locking on the rifle in Niels's hands. "You? What did you do to the crew? I was in the mess when—" His face twisted into a confused storm of shock, fear, and disbelief. It took several minutes to convince Eric that Niels wasn't leading some uprising of convict labor and that they hadn't pumped the ventilation with some psychotropic gas to drive the crew into a homicidal frenzy. They almost got through to him. But when the subject of the aliens came up, it all fell apart. Eric hadn't seen them, and to him, that part of the story was simply too insane to accept. "I don't know what you're trying to pull," he said, glaring at Niels. "And I don't get why you cut this thug loose." He nodded at Dams. "But if you're looking for a way to explain this shit show, maybe come up with something better than bug-eyed space monsters." Niels glanced at Dams. "No point wasting time trying to convince him," Dams said. "But here's what does bother me. How the hell did he survive?" "Good point." Niels turned back to Eric, who now sat propped against the wall, still under restraint. "You said everyone in the mess just snapped and went at each other, right? I believe you. I saw the same thing myself. But how did you make it out? You said you were in the mess." Eric shot Niels a suspicious look. "Why would you care? Trying to finish the job?" Dams suddenly understood. "Let me handle this," he said, stepping forward. "When everything went to hell in the mess, you weren't in there. You'd stepped out, maybe to the locker room, maybe the bathroom, whatever. By the time you got back, everyone was already tearing each other apart. Someone came at you, maybe more than one, but you fought back, got your hands on a rifle and ran." Eric narrowed his eyes. "More or less, except for the rifle part. But how the hell did you know?" "It all fits." Dams cut in, speaking to Niels now, ignoring the kid on the floor. "Mental waves barely penetrate steel bulkheads. The aliens must have hit the mess hall from the opposite entrance, so he didn't get caught in the blast zone. Unless he's—" Dams tapped his forearm meaningfully. Niels gave a grim, dry smile. "Unless he's a latent passive, yeah, and just happened to manifest at the perfect time. Better than you did. But I doubt it. Your version sounds more likely." "Where's the mess located?" Niels pulled out his communicator and powered it on. The ship's schematic blinked onto the screen, a blue labyrinth veined with thick, aggressive streaks of red, like cancer spreading through a body. "Here," Niels said, zooming in on the relevant section of the map. The area was already marked in red. "Looks like the mess hall incident Eric got caught up in happened before we managed to get into the system. But the situation's changing by the minute, and if we want access again, we'll need to find another node, and there's no guarantee the trick will work twice." "We need to try and get here," Dam said, pointing to the last large blue zone in the forward section of the ship. "There might still be uninfected, uncompromised crew. Survivors. What's in that area?" "That's the VIP living quarters," Niels said, frowning thoughtfully. "But access is restricted. I've barely ever been there. It's usually reserved for high-value passengers. He met Dams's eyes. People like the curator and his entourage. Dams fell silent for a moment. The Imperial curator, a man who, until very recently, had literally owned Dams's life, since all delayed executions were classified as property of the Imperial bloodline. A man who, like the aliens, could give mental orders, and who had labeled Dams as a uniquely dangerous threat, one of the rare few who could resist that mental domination. Now, ironically, that might make him exactly the kind of ally they needed. "You've got to be kidding me," Eric said. Dams looked at him for a beat, wondering what would drive a young guy like that to take a job as grim as a prison galley guard. Unlike the people born in the massive hypercities of Earth, orbital citizens tended to value self-reliance and isolation. Imperial bureaucracy didn't usually appeal to them. Aliens? "Oh, no way," Niels said dryly. "This is all just improv theater. You're our test audience." He sighed. "Look, can you promise you won't try anything stupid if we take the cuffs off?" "You sure about this?" Dams asked. Niels shrugged. "We can't just leave him here, cuffed and unarmed, and dragging him along like a full-size rag doll isn't an option either." The old Dams, the decorated captain of Imperial Special Forces, would have done exactly that. He would have walked out of the reserve stockpile room, locked the door behind him, and left Eric sitting on the floor. But new Dams couldn't do that anymore. "All right, I promise," Eric said, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Dams. Clearly, the idea of being left alone, restrained, on a ship where God only knew what was happening, was more terrifying than following a grizzled overseer and a dangerous rebel whose freedom made zero sense. Dams pulled the control fob from his pocket. "Doesn't mean we trust you completely," he said. "You will take the point." "So you'll always have a clean shot at my back?" Eric asked. The massive bruise on the left side of his face had swelled so much it made him look like he was constantly winking. "You fired the first shot, not me," Dams said, taking the rifle from Niels. The overseer handed it over without hesitation, clearly understanding Dams was the better shot. "Where'd you even pick this up?" he asked. "There's a weapons lockers at the external control stations around the prison block," Eric said, standing up slowly. "Of course," Niels turned to Dams. "We're not allowed to bring firearms inside, only neural whips. But every exit point has live weapons in case something goes sideways." He nodded Eric to continue. "After the mess hall massacre, I ran to one of the outer posts, but there was no one there. So I grabbed the rifle and came here. Figured maybe someone had survived the riot and made it to this storage unit." Dams cursed silently. He'd passed through one of those outer control stations on his way to the drive deck, and it hadn't even occurred to him that a weapons cache might be nearby. If he'd thought to check. But then again, what would have changed? He likely would have started a shootout with the aliens. A flechette rifle, designed for quelling riots of prisoners in light canvas jumpsuits against unknown energy weapons, wielded by alien troopers wrapped in armored combat suits, and backed by hundreds of slaves dragged from their pods and turned into berserk puppets. 3 steps toward the door, Dams ordered. Eric obeyed. Not eagerly, but without the earlier defiance in his eyes or posture. Dams pressed the button on the remote. The smart cuffs softened back into a flexible strip and slid off Eric's wrists onto the floor. Niels picked them up and tucked them into his pocket, then took the remote from Dams. "Lost mine in the chaos," he muttered. "But we might still need these." "You mapped a route yet?" Dams asked. "Yeah," Niels nodded. "But there's a problem. There is no clean path to the VIP sector through the blue zones. We'll have to cross 2 red areas, and that's assuming the situation hasn't changed again. The aliens are probably expanding their control every minute. Dams checked the ammo readout on the rifle's magazine. 54 rounds left out of 70, plus a spare mag he'd pulled from Eric's pocket. Not exactly overwhelming firepower, but better than fists and a pocket knife. Then we'd better move fast, before things get completely, he almost said hopeless, but stopped himself. No point rattling Niels or Eric unnecessarily. Old habits kicked in, the kind drilled in for maintaining morale under pressure. He nodded to Eric. The younger man swallowed hard, then opened the door and peeked into the hallway. Clear, he whispered, scanning both directions. Which way? Niels glanced at his communicator. Left until we hit the ring corridor, then right. If we're lucky, we'll pass through the reserve power unit bay. And how will I know if I see one of aliens? Eric asked. Dams grinned. Trust me, you'll know them when you see them. But that's not the kind of curiosity you want satisfied. Move. Eric nodded and started down the corridor, casting wary glances down every side passage and shooting nervous looks at every sealed door he passed. Dams noted, with some surprise, that for a non-professional, the kid moved decently. Not too fast, not too slow. Alert, cautious, and trying to keep an eye on his surroundings. Training? Or just natural instincts? Either way, it was useful. It also suggested that on some level, Eric had started believing their story, or at least feared it might be true. Now he was half expecting some nightmare alien thing to leap at him from the next corner. What neither Eric nor Niels seemed to realize, or if they did, they kept it to themselves, was that Dams hadn't sent Eric to take point just to keep him in check. That was only half the reason. The other half was about environmental monitoring. Eric was the only one in their little group who could reliably serve as an early warning system for mental interference. According to Niels, he was completely inert, immune to mental orders and incapable of sensing them. Dams, on the other hand, could feel them, but his active resistance would instantly tip off any hostile telepath trying to manipulate him. That left Eric. Any sudden change in his behavior, any weird hesitation, shift in tone, glassy look in the eyes, could mean someone or something had seized control. Of course, there was always the possibility that Eric had already been programmed, that his story about escaping the mess hall was nothing more than a fabricated memory planted by the aliens. Strictly speaking, the same could be said of Niels. After all, Dams had no solid proof of anything. Not even that the strange tattoo on the overseer's forearm actually marked him as a passive. But this was where Dams fell back on what the Army called Occam's combat razor. If a potential threat isn't immediate and there's no way to verify it right now, you shelve it and focus on what can kill you in the next 30 seconds. And right now, priority 1 was staying alive and pushing toward that forward section of the ship, where there might still be uninfected survivors. A place where they could regroup, organize, and mount some kind of resistance against the invaders. Only now did his brain, operating on moment-to-moment instincts until this point, carve out enough bandwidth for a deeper question. What's the point of all this? Why had the aliens boarded the galley? What did they want? Behind that one question crowded others, waiting their turn on the edge of his awareness. Who are they? Where did they come from? How did they reach the solar system? And, most urgently, who let him out of his solitary cell? But like so many other thoughts since this all began, those questions were cut off, because just minutes after they passed through the reserve power unit bay, they walked straight into an ambush.